Coming up on Bridge City News, Lethbridge police are warning about a new scam making the rounds in our city. This one involves money laundering. The state of Minnesota has filed a human rights complaint against the Minneapolis Police Department following the death of George Floyd. And violent protests continued across the United States as thousands are demanding change when it comes to battling racism.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. Lethbridge police investigated a sudden death around 12:30 this afternoon at the Lethbridge Supervised Consumption Site. BCN's Jeanette Roche was there. Now, Jeanette, early reports suggest the 33-year-old victim may have died of a drug overdose, but she was not connected with the SES or Arches.
Yeah, Hal, not too many details coming out at this time, but what we do know is that there was a body located right outside the entrance of the supervised consumption site, right at the top of the ramp behind me, right beside those stairs in that little corner. According to authorities, it was an employee who located the victim and called police. We're also told it was a woman who died. That was confirmed to me by a manager here at the supervised consumption site. That manager also wanted to make it clear that the victim was not using the site when she passed away. In other words, she wasn't consuming drugs today while under supervision at Arches. It's also not clear at this time whether the victim is one of their clients or not. The employee I spoke with said the deceased hadn't been identified yet, so they might not actually be clear on who the victim is. Arches has told me that an official written statement will be sent out to the media at a later time. Right now, an investigation is underway and next of kin still need to be notified. Hal?
Thank you so much, Jeanette. Police say the medical examiner's office has been contacted and the woman's body will be transported to Calgary for an autopsy. Law enforcement across North America has been put under the microscope when it comes to its treatment of black people. The Lethbridge Police Service Interim Police Chief Scott Woods addressed what our city is doing to combat racism in our community. As BCN's Ainsley O'Reilly discovered, protesters also showed up at the police station today to express their concerns.
A handful of protesters stood outside the Lethbridge Police Station Wednesday afternoon in support of the Black Lives Matter movement, brave enough to share the discrimination they've faced in Lethbridge.
I mean, there have been instances where I've been walking downtown and I've been called the N-word, or someone has made a comment about my hair. Those microaggressions lead to macroaggressions. And so I personally experienced more microaggressions. I have friends who have been pulled over just for being black, just because they were looking suspicious. I've had other friends who have been called the N-word, and to be quite frank, I'm really tired of it.
There's a really big problem in Lethbridge, not only against black people. Every single black person I know here has been called the N-word by someone on the street.
Recently, Lethbridge Police Chief Scott Woods released a statement highlighting his response to the tragic death of George Floyd. Woods said that stories like these and seeing the protests going on in the United States has caused our local police force to think about what they can do.
It certainly puts us in the limelight, and it certainly has us to have to take a step back and have a look at what we're doing. Sometimes require us to do some self-reflection and look inward and look at ways to do things better. It's all about just being a good cop, doing the right things, subscribing to and following through on the values that we have with respect, integrity, treating people fairly, equally, all within the law. And that's really the path forward.
Even our youngest citizens refused to be silent.
I believe that everybody should have equal rights, because just because you have a different color skin doesn't mean you're a bad person. I've had 43 honks so far, and that makes me feel really, really good.
Knowing that
Knowing that a lot of people support what I'm doing here.
For Bridge City News, I'm Ainsley O'Reilly.
Residents in Lethbridge will be able to participate in a peaceful demonstration in the fight against racism tomorrow.
We are a movement against racism, and we are very much for the equal treatment of any person of color, with an emphasis on Black lives and Indigenous lives at the moment. I feel as though these groups of people are very marginalized groups of people. So I find that very often they're treated unfairly within the justice system by police, and by other groups of people in specific. So when people come here, we are going to be very much observing social distancing rules. We want to make sure everyone is staying safe.
The protest will take place at Lethbridge City Hall tomorrow afternoon, beginning at 3 p.m. Lethbridge police need our help with an investigation involving the theft of $13,000 worth of perfume. Police say late yesterday afternoon, a male and female stole the high-end perfume from various Shoppers Drug Mart stores in Lethbridge. It's believed the female's bag contained a demagnetizing device, so security sensors would not go off. If you have any information that can help police with their investigation, call them right away at 403-328-4444. Lethbridge police are also warning about a new scam making the rounds. A 24-year-old man was defrauded out of $11,000 thanks to a money transfer hoax. The man received a call from a fraudster advising him that he was under investigation for money laundering. The caller instructed him to take money out of his account and deposit it into a safe Bitcoin account using a Bitcoin ATM located at Stafford Drive North. Police want to remind us to be wary of phone calls from anyone claiming to represent law enforcement or government agencies. The province is establishing a new committee to listen to law-abiding firearms owners while cracking down on criminals who have illegal guns. The Alberta Firearms Committee says it will provide recommendations on how our province can better assert areas of provincial jurisdiction while respecting the long history of responsible firearms ownership. The committee will be chaired by Brooks Medicine Hat MLA Michaela Glasgow.
Since being elected, I have stood up in the House on more than one occasion to speak about Alberta's proud history of responsible gun ownership. I grew up around firearms. I was always taught that safety came first and that guns were useful tools for life when employed in a safe fashion. When the federal government instituted its gun grab on Canadians, I have to say that I, as well as a large majority of my constituents, were appalled. Many Albertans have expressed a deep desire for more autonomy from Ottawa. I hear about it regularly. The passing of C-71 last year imposed unnecessary red tape, fees, and hurdles on law-abiding citizens and business owners.
The province of Alberta announced today that just over 6,500 people have now recovered from COVID-19, leaving just 344 active cases. There are still 48 people hospitalized, with 6 people in ICUs. Sadly, there are also 2 new deaths. The Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Deena Hinshaw, says it is good to see more First Nations groups in the province being proactive when it comes to protecting their communities against the coronavirus.
The Alexis Nakota Sioux First Nation on Treaty 6 territory has started a national social media campaign called #ProtectOurElders. The campaign encourages Indigenous youth living in Canada to be partners in protecting elders from exposure to COVID-19. For more about the campaign, visit protectourelders.ca.
A professor at the University of Lethbridge says that racism is a broad term. The death of George Floyd in Minneapolis has sparked widespread looting and rioting across the United States. As Micah Quinn explains now, a business owner here in Lethbridge says rioting and looting is not the way to go, and there's a better way to protest the death of George Floyd.
Abiola Ogonyemi is the owner of Hashed Gardens Cannabis and a board member at the Lethbridge Multicultural Center. He says the recent actions of looters and rioters in America over the death of George Floyd doesn't speak well.
It gives room for the opposition to say, hey, look at what these people are doing. And again, it justifies whatever narrative that is being out there.
Ogonyemi says there are better ways to protest instead of rioting and looting. And that's exactly what protesters in the United States did as they staged lie-ins, where they laid down in the middle of the street to symbolize the final moments of George Floyd's life.
I saw a guy, a couple of people were just lying down on the floor and screaming, I can't breathe. That's more powerful than looting. You can hold back your economics. You can hold back from purchasing stuff from them. You cannot even look within yourself and say, hey, we can do it better, because we've seen people do it better. That's the better way to preach.
Glenda Bonifacio is an associate professor at the University of Lethbridge, and she says there are many forms of racism.
It is intersectional racism. You also have gender plays into racism. You have disability plays into racism. So it is also intersectional. When we look into intersectional racism, you have degrees of violence of people in these particular spots or have particular identities, not only based on their race.
There is a protest against racial discrimination being organized at City Hall on June 4th, and Ogonyemi says he will be there. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe calls justice for Floyd scrawled on a war memorial outrageous vandalism. He also praised hundreds of people who peacefully protested in front of the legislature.
These events were in response to other recent events throughout North America. And today we saw two very different kinds of expression. We saw a peaceful demonstration in support of tolerance, against racial injustice, and to make the clear statement that Black lives matter. Like so many others, I have been deeply disturbed by recent events that we have observed in the U.S. And I was disturbed and horrified by the brutal and senseless killing of George Floyd. It's disturbing to see the use of tear gas and rubber bullets against peaceful protesters. And it's disturbing to see some of these protests used as a pretense for violence, for vandalism, and for looting. Racism remains a problem in our society and in our communities, and we should take every opportunity to speak out against it.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford says Canada and the United States are like night and day when it comes to problems with racism. Ford says he believes Canada does not have the deep and systemic problems with racism present in the U.S. He said there is no place here for racism and hatred.
I'm on the phone till 11, 12 o'clock at night, going 100 miles an hour, and I'm worried about Ontario. That's what I'm concerned about. They have their issues. There's no doubt they have their issues in the U.S. and they have to fix their issues. But it's like night and day compared to Canada and the U.S. I'm proud to be Canadian. I'm proud to be the Premier of Ontario, and I know Canadians just won't tolerate it. And I won't tolerate it, and I'm sure every leader in this province won't tolerate it.
NDP leader Jagmeet Singh says U.S. President Donald Trump's rhetorical attacks on racial minorities have parallels to schoolyard bullying. When Prime Minister Justin Trudeau chose to talk about racism in Canada instead of condemning it in the United States, Singh says he picked the wrong side.
I think the Prime Minister has an important role. Canada has an important role to call out when things that are so heinous are going on. There is a time where we cannot be silent, and this is that time. When President Trump says those hateful comments, those divisive comments, the international community has a responsibility to call it out, to point out that it's wrong.
Thousands of protesters gathered on the front lawn of the Minnesota Capitol as part of a youth protest for George Floyd late yesterday. The crowd listened to speakers chant, "Say his name, George Floyd."
I see and love every one of y'all. America was built off the slaves of my ancestors. My grandmother in her hometown and my grandfather were both civil rights activists and both Black Panthers, so I understand what needs to be done, and growing up with them and seeing the change that they brought to the community. People are just getting tired of it. I'm tired of just the way it's being treated. The one thing I really enjoy about this crowd is it's diverse, especially like all the other protests have been super diverse, so it's every single nationality, every single ethnicity coming out here to show support to the Black community.
I think a lot of white people are seeing what's going on in the news, and it's really forcing a lot of them to come out in the streets. It's just been an endless cascade of hashtags of Black people dying, and it feels like nothing's really being done by our political leaders to actually enact real change to that.
The state of Minnesota has now officially filed a human rights complaint against the Minneapolis Police Department in the death of George Floyd.
But I think the thing I'm hearing from the protesters is we're not watching, and we don't care what you say. We care what you do. So today, as a step towards that deconstruction of systemic racism, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights is filing a commissioner's charge of discrimination to launch a civil rights investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department. The investigation will review MPD's policies, procedures, and practices over the last 10 years to determine if the department has utilized systemic discriminatory practices towards people of color. When the Minnesota Department of Human Rights finds civil rights violations, they seek structural change to prevent discrimination from occurring again. The Minnesota Department of Human Rights will also seek an agreement with the Minneapolis Police Department to implement interim measures immediately in advance of long-term measures to address systemic discriminatory practices.
There are also reports that all 4 police officers involved in the George Floyd death have now been charged. Protesters lined a street across from the White House in Washington, D.C. last night. The crowd raised their hands and shouted, "Hands up, don't shoot," in an area guarded by soldiers, police, and military police.
I
I've been a victim of police brutality, and, you know, I'm out here to make sure that it doesn't happen to anybody else again. I was actually here in D.C. doing a pizza delivery, and was driving down a road and saw a guy run in front of my car. I had stopped, went to get going again. Next thing I know, I had a cop's gun pointed at my head.
No kidding.
So he thought that I was the guy that he was chasing. Not even close.
Really?
But next thing I know, I'm outside on the ground until they finished running all my information and everything. And then told me pretty much that I was in the wrong spot at the wrong time and I need to get the hell out of there.
Protests have engulfed cities across the U.S. following the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. A lot of the focus has been on the rioting, looting, and burning of buildings. Kelly Bundy of Louisville, Kentucky says most protesters, like her, are peaceful people called to duty after a lifetime of inequality.
Curfew is not justice. Keeping us in the house is not going to prevent them from killing us. We already seen that with Breonna Taylor. She's dead and she was in the house asleep. She didn't do anything. I've been making sure everyone doesn't approach the police because we don't want to incite a riot. We don't want to do that. We want them to hear us. That's all we want. We want justice for Breonna and justice for David. Breonna Taylor! What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now! Looting and things like that, stealing, no. I'm not a part of any of that. My protest crew, which is out here today, we're not a part of that. And if we see you doing it, we will stop you.
A victim services group is worried proposed legislation would allow the province of Alberta to raid a fund meant to help those hurt by crime. The UCP introduced a bill late last week that would expand the scope of the Victims of Crime Fund to include specialized police teams, drug treatment courts, and the hiring of more Crown prosecutors. The Alberta Police-based Victim Services Association says if the bill passes, the Solicitor General will be allowed to unfettered access to the fund. Money for the fund is meant to help crime victims through financial relief and support programs. The government says it now wants to use some of the money to prevent crime. If you notice that the grass in city property is looking a little high or no flowers are planted where they usually are, it's because these services have been limited. Parks Manager Dave Ellis with the City of Lethbridge says COVID-19 has caused many of these services to scale back.
Specifically, we have to operate in the same, with the same guidelines and restrictions as everybody else. So social distancing or physical distancing in our vehicles. We use our vehicles to transport crews to different sites. And if we can't fill the vehicle up, we just can't have as many people doing the job. So and that's what it's related to. It's not related to our budget availability. It's related to the pandemic and the things that we have to do to keep our staff safe.
The city also decided not to plant any trees this season. Ellis says that long-term, this could have negative effects on the environment. Convocation ceremonies are a little tricky this time of year, especially during COVID-19. The Lethbridge School Division has found a way to celebrate its Indigenous graduates despite today's challenging circumstances.
Our Indigenous education team came up with the idea about having sort of a drive-through. Some of the other schools have been doing it. So we decided that at one point of it, like as they come in, they get a gift box. And then they take a picture with the Oki sign and as well as the teepee. The interesting part about the whole thing too is that nature is such an important role in Blackfoot philosophy. It's in some of the philosophy, it is a guiding system, it's a teaching system. So being able to do that outside and sort of like what the old Blackfoot people would say is that, the sun is a witness to the process as well.
We had kind of a mixed bag today. Sunshine mixed with cloud, a little bit of wind. Will the warm temperatures continue? Complete weather details are coming up. It was another beautiful day in Lethbridge, lots of sunshine. Jeanette Roche is here now with a full look at the weather forecast. Jeanette, it seems like the mercury is going to continue to climb.
Yeah, those warmer temperatures should be sticking around. However, it's the clouds that we are going to be seeing increase over the next few days. Beginning into tonight, we're going to see increasing cloudiness overnight, high of 8 degrees. We could see some gusty winds this evening as well. And then into tomorrow, more clouds. We could see a 30% chance of some rain tomorrow, high of 16 degrees, and the overnight low tomorrow evening, 4 degrees. And then as we look into Friday, we're going to see that increasing cloud. There is actually possibly a slight chance of some drizzle as well and into Friday night. 20 degrees is the high for Friday. We could see that rain beginning Friday night into Saturday, where there's a 60% chance of showers Saturday and Saturday evening. 19 is the high for Saturday, and then the sun will come out on Sunday. High of 19 there. Monday and Tuesday, mix of sun and cloud with highs of 16 and 18 degrees for those days. And as we're looking at those temperatures, you can see that they are kind of shrinking back into the teens, whereas the expected high for this time of year is around 21 degrees. The expected low around 7. Now, the highest temperature on this day on record was in 1970. It was 33 degrees, and the chilliest was 0. That was back in 1993. The sun woke up this morning at 5:27 a.m. and our evening sunset 9:32 p.m. So what is that? 16 hours-ish of daylight. Now, as we look into tomorrow's highs across the country, Vancouver, Victoria sitting at 19 degrees tomorrow with partly cloudy skies. There is a chance of some showers tomorrow in Edmonton. 15 is their high, 16 the high in Calgary tomorrow under sunny skies. As we look further into Saskatchewan across the prairies, we're going to be seeing 19 in Saskatoon. There is a risk of a thunderstorm tomorrow. Sunshine expected in Regina, 24 is the high there. Winnipeg will be seeing a lovely, warm, sunny day, 27 is their high. Lots of humidity expected in Toronto. Their humidex is 32, UV index of 9 or very high, 29 is their high there. Sunshine expected. Ottawa could see some rain, 28 is the high, 26 in Montreal under sunny skies. And we're going to see more sun shining across Atlantic Canada as well. Fredericton's high, 25. Sunny skies in Charlottetown with a high of 21. Now, Halifax could see a possibility of some drizzle tomorrow. 20 is their high. St. John's, Newfoundland, they could see up to 10 millimeters of rain tomorrow, and their high is 16 expected. There you go. That is your weather forecast.
The Bank of Canada says the economy appears to have avoided a worst-case scenario when it comes to the coronavirus pandemic. The central bank said in April that GDP could drop between 15 and 30% in the second quarter over the fourth quarter of last year. It said today, however, that it only expects a decline of now 10 to 20% in the current quarter. The bank made the announcement as it left its key overnight interest rate unchanged at 0.25%. Two of our country's largest telecommunications companies say they will not use Chinese tech giant Huawei for their next generation 5G wireless network. Officials for both Bell and TELUS said they're going to stick with Ericsson and Nokia. Canada and its security agencies have been studying whether to use equipment from Huawei as carriers prepare to roll out fifth-generation technology designed to support medical devices, self-driving cars, and other technology. Huawei is the world's biggest supplier of network gear used by phone and internet companies. It has long been seen as a front for spying by China's military and its highly skilled security services. The Trump administration says it will block Chinese airlines from flying into the United States later this month. The Transportation Department says it will suspend flights by 4 carriers beginning June 16th and the latest escalation of tensions between the two countries. It says China is violating an air travel agreement for refusing to allow U.S. airlines Delta and United to resume flights to China. The airlines had wanted to restart service this week after flights were suspended because of the COVID-19 outbreak. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was up 180 points on the day to 15,575. The Dow was up 527 points to finish at 26,269. The S&P 500 was up 42 points to 3122, and the Nasdaq was up 74 points to finish at 9682. Oil was down 6 cents to $36.75 per barrel. Natural gas was up 3 cents to $1.81. Gold was up 13 cents to $16.99.81 an ounce. And silver was even on the day at $17.66 an ounce. Wheat is at $257 per metric ton. Barley's at $243. Canola's at $462. And corn is at $229 per metric ton. Live cattle were up 15 cents to $95.75. Feeder cattle were up 80 cents to $134.58. And lean hogs were down $3.75 on the day to $51.45. The Canadian dollar was even on the day today at $74.10 US. Recapping one of our top stories this hour, Lethbridge police are warning about a new scam making the rounds. A 24-year-old man was defrauded out of $11,000 thanks to a money transfer hoax. The man received a call from a fraudster advising him that he was under investigation for money laundering. The caller instructed him to take money out of his account and deposit it into a safe Bitcoin account using a Bitcoin ATM machine located at Stafford Drive North. Police want to remind us to be wary of phone calls from anyone claiming to represent law enforcement or government agencies. The persecution of Christians continues in many countries around the world, but it's particularly bad in Asia. BCN's Jeanette Roche chats with Greg Musselman from Voice of the Martyrs, who has the details next.
Canada is a country where Canadians, for the most part, are able to live out whichever faith they practice and feel safe doing so. But imagine living in a country where your faith could cost you everything, including your family, or in some cases, even your own life. Our guest today is Greg Musselman with the Voice of the Martyrs Canada. He joins me today from Edmonton. Greg, welcome back to our program. So good to have you.
Good to be here, and nice to be with you, Jeanette.
All right. Now, Greg, you've traveled all around the world with your ministry, and you've seen all kinds of things and have spoken with all kinds of people, including those who have been persecuted for living out their faith. Now, if we turn our attention to Nigeria for just a moment, the numbers are staggering, aren't they? More than 600 people have been killed this year alone in Nigeria for practicing Christianity.
Yeah, it's a tragic situation, and I've just been interviewing a fellow from Nigeria, one of the leaders there. Yunusa is his name, and he's with a ministry called Christian Solidarity Worldwide Nigeria, and we partner with the Voice of the Martyrs with him. And hearing what's going on currently. I mean, with the Voice of the Martyrs, we have our what's called Persecution and Prayer Alert that comes out every week. And there's always something about Nigeria. We found that it's unbelievable, really. When you hear like large statistics, more than 30,000 killed since 2009, 620 or more that we know of anyway, have been killed already this year. When you start to look at it from the individual families, so a man named Jonathan Yakubu, his wife, and 3 young children were all killed. And then they had a massive funeral. They dig this big hole, and you see all these people, our brothers and sisters in Christ, and it breaks your heart. And, as you mentioned, I've traveled all over the world, but Nigeria is probably the country when I go there, when I document the stories of persecution and I come back, it's the one that usually hits me the hardest, because talking to people that have had limbs, taken off, there's scars, there's family members have been killed. We're trying to help them, the widows especially, and with the orphans, but it's a situation that is so brutal, and it doesn't look like it's going to get any better. And, so as I was talking to Yunusa, I said, well, if there's no hope that the government's going to, get in here and at least prevent some of this from happening, what's the hope? And his hope is in Jesus, that this side of eternity, things are pretty terrible, but there's something to look forward to. That's when we die. And that's really has to be presented before the people of Nigeria to make sure that they have their hope in Christ.
What a tragic situation they are facing over there. So, that just begs the question then, is Christianity growing or shrinking in numbers there with this persecution, or is it too early to tell right now with all of that?
Yeah, well, I think, in general, Africa has seen quite an explosion in Christianity. And we take a country like Nigeria, it's the most populous African nation, and the southern part of the country, for the most part, is predominantly Christian. The northern part of Nigeria is predominantly Muslim. And then you've got in the center part called Plateau State, a city called Jos, and many missionaries that came from Canada, America, and other places, that's where they were. It was kind of the launching point to bring Christ into the northern part of Nigeria. But what has happened is the militant Islamists have determined in their mind they are going to turn Nigeria into an Islamic state and under strict Sharia law. And so with that, the Christians that are there, and there's significant numbers of Christians that are in northern Nigeria as well. There's churches there, and there's communities like this particular one that I was talking about earlier, Gonan Rogo. It is a place that is a Baptist village, and there's a big Baptist church, and all the people that were recently killed were from that church. So there are areas and pockets where there are Christians. But these Islamists, like the Boko Haram, who are listed as the second most terrorist group in the world, and then the Fulani herdsmen, they're number 4. So you got both these groups working in northern Nigeria. So there's a lot of persecution. Yet, to answer your question, is Christianity growing in Nigeria? Absolutely.
Now you're saying how dangerous the north was. So there's pockets of the south that are a little bit more safe than in Nigeria?
Yeah, there is. Yeah, we don't hear a lot of persecution, say in Lagos and some of the larger cities. I mean, there's still things that are going on, and that can be more of a cultural situation. Let's say a family is Muslim, they're living in the south, and family members become Christians. They could be killed, but they're more like being ostracized or losing their jobs, that kind of thing. But definitely there are, people that are coming into relationship with Jesus in the South. But because, again, there's not the persecution. And unfortunately, in the southern part of Nigeria, there's some pretty interesting theologies like the prosperity gospel, that kind of thing that, they're trying to follow the American way. And there's some things about the church that are a little bit odd. I found one of the things that was really interesting in like Plateau State in the center part, that's where we were. And then we were going into the north and doing interviews. And I remember one particular day I had interviewed a number of people. One guy told me the story of how his father and a number of the men in his church were driven by the Islamists into the building, and they killed them all. And he got cut and shot, and he had to pretend he was dead. Bukhar Samson is his name, and eventually became the pastor of that church. But I was, he was telling me the story, and I videoed it. In fact, I wrote about him in my book, and I seen the scars, and then talked to others that had been just through this brutality, and we've met dozens of children and orphans as a result of the persecution, especially in the north, that have come to the south. And then I was in this hotel, and I heard the music, and it was worship. And I go, I love African worship. And I'm in there, and then they put on the message, which was on video, and it was a prosperity message about getting a better car and a better life. And I'm going, man, and just down the road, people are dying for Jesus. So they have the same issues and the same challenges, Jeanette, as we do. But yet in the middle of all that, God is working, and some say in spite of persecution, but I think a lot of the time people have to make a decision. Either you're in the kingdom fully, both feet in, or you're not so sure. And of course, God loves us no matter where we're at, but it does cause people to really, consider the cost, which we're all supposed to do when we follow Jesus.
That's fascinating. And of course, speaking of dangerous countries to practice your faith, North Korea and Iran are certainly up there as far as most dangerous places to practice Christianity, right? So how is the underground church doing in North Korea?
Well, that's always a very interesting question, because for many years, our friends at Open Doors, another ministry that works with persecuted Christians, have the World Watch List. And North Korea, year after year after year, more than a decade, have been on the top of that list. Now, Afghanistan is close to that. But in North Korea, because you've got what's called the Juche system, where it's kind of the worship of the Kim family, and it's basically a ripoff of the Bible. And Christianity, of course, exposes the falseness of Juche. So if you're caught with a Bible, you can be put in a concentration camp. You could be killed. And not only you, but your family members. They're so paranoid of Christianity. I mean, interestingly enough, 100 years ago, North Korea was actually stronger than South Korea. Then the war came along, and then there was the split. South Korea now has 4 of the 5 largest churches in the world. And then just across that border, just the demilitarized zone there in between North and South, is you can be killed for having a Bible or for meeting. But the interesting thing is that the church still is growing. It's growing at a faster rate percentage-wise than here in North America. Now, they can't meet publicly. They have their show churches there in Pyongyang, but it's controlled. They can't openly meet. And so they're meeting in their homes, and they have to be very careful even to tell their children if they're Christians, because if their children say something at school, the children come home and mom and dad are gone. They are put in a concentration camp, never to be seen again, or they could even be executed. I mean, that's how serious it is. And yet they're meeting in their homes. And what's kind of been an interesting thing is I was talking to Eric Foley, and we work with him. He's with Voice of the Martyrs Korea in Seoul, and I've had opportunity to be there and to meet North Korean Christians who are absolutely amazing people. But I asked him, well, how is the COVID-19 and the shutdown, affecting the North Korean Christians? And he said, well, it's actually, for them, it's been a positive. because they have to work long, long days, have very little time at home to, to study the Bible, and they have to, again, doing this in secret. But because of the shutdown, they've been put into their homes, and the government officials don't want to go near them. And so they've been able to take time of studying the Bible in worship. And then with Voice of the Martyrs Korea out of Seoul, we broadcast into their, the Bible and, commentaries and encouraging the believers there. And so for them, this time has been actually in some ways positive. Now, when people say, well, how many Christians are in North Korea? And, it's really hard to know the numbers on these things, because what happens is so many of them have been executed, have been imprisoned, but it's still growing. So maybe 100,000 of Christians there, and maybe 30,000 of those would be in concentration camps. But people are coming to know the Lord. And again, getting numbers in such a closed society is very difficult. But I can tell you, the ones that are there are very determined. And when I was talking with Eric the other day, I said, well, how can we pray for Christians in North Korea? What should I tell my Canadian believing friends? And he said, it's interesting that he had asked that question of a North Korean leader many years ago. And this North Korean leader said to him, what, pray for us? We pray for you.
Now, Greg, you'd mentioned the pandemic. So now you also had mentioned to me earlier that you were supposed to travel to Turkey to speak with some Iranian Christians before this whole pandemic arose, right, for COVID-19. So maybe talk really quickly, in the amount of time we have left, about what you were going to do there.
Yeah, we were going to go to Turkey, the southern part, and I was actually going to be doing a trip to Israel with 100 Huntley Street. And that trip got shut down because we had to quarantine for 14 days, and the trip was 10 days. So I'm not a mathematician, but those numbers didn't add up. And then because I was in the neighborhood, I was going to travel with one of our partners that we work with. He's an Iranian, lives in Canada, and to bring aid to Christian refugees from Iran, and they were getting into Turkey. Now, I have been there in the past in Turkey and have met with Iranian Christians who have left the country because of the unemployment and the problems and the oppression and the rest of it. And so they have, got into Turkey. So we were going to go there and bring them food and aid and, and get their stories and find other ways in which we can help them. I know in one case, a family there, two of their children both have severe medical issues. And so Voice of the Martyrs Canada has been helping them. And, just to talk to them, to find out what's going on and how we can help them. Of course, everything got shut down. And, of course, we're concerned because the people that we're responsible for, that we feel responsibility for, trying to get the funds there. But I found, Jeanette, is that the Canadian people that support Voice of the Martyrs have not held back their giving. In fact, they're really wanting us to help persecuted Christians, because whether it's, in Turkey or in other places, especially Pakistan, India, Christian refugees from Syria that are in Lebanon, we're hearing so many cases that the Christians are not getting the food and the supplies that other people are, because they are not, say, Muslim, they're not Hindu, whatever the majority religion is. And so they're paying a huge price. And we've heard of Christians that in Pakistan, as an example, that are starving to death and are dying because they can't get food. If they would renounce Jesus, they can have food. But many of them would say, I'd rather die than deny Jesus. I mean, and of course others they would say, well, I need food, I need to feed my kids. I'll just say I'm a Muslim, but in my heart I'm for Jesus. So, I mean, God is a God of mercy, but these are, there's some difficult situations. In fact, we're going to have a conference call this week with a number of other leaders, well, actually next week, from around the world, that how the COVID-19 is affecting persecuted Christians, and ways that as international groups that work with persecuted Christians to help them get food.
Makes you realize how much we really take our freedoms for granted over here when you look at what the rest of the world is going through, what many people are going through. Greg, thank you so much for joining me today. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to be on the show, and it was nice talking to you today, Jeanette.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau recently paused for 21 seconds when asked to respond to U.S. President Donald Trump using tear gas to clear away many of the protesters for his photo op on Monday. To talk more about it is one of our regular contributors and political reporter, Brian Lilley. Mr. Lilley, how did Mr. Trudeau respond after the 21-second delay?
Well, you know, I've seen Justin Trudeau. I've watched him over many years. I've been covering him since he was a neophyte politician in 2008. In fact, if you want to go far enough back, I sat outside the Trudeau family home waiting for people like Justin Trudeau when his father was dying. Not, you know, one of my finer moments, but one of the things that you have to do in the media when a major political figure is in the condition Pierre Trudeau was in then. So I've known the PM on a certain level for a long time. I've never seen him pause as long as this. 21 seconds, he looked up, he looked down, he clenched his jaw, he gave an audible sigh, and then he started talking about racism, but he didn't talk about what was going on in the United States, which was the question. The whole issue of Donald Trump using security forces to shoot tear gas so that he could walk to the church that was damaged. I believe it's St. John the Evangelist in Washington, D.C., an Anglican church, or Episcopal, as they call it in the United States, that is known as the Church of the Presidents. Every president since James Madison has visited this church, and it was damaged with arson during the protest the other day. Well, Donald Trump walked over, and it was a bit of a bizarre photo op. So he uses tear gas to clear away protesters so that he can walk over, and then just stands there and holds up a Bible. Very strange, but Trudeau didn't touch on any of that. Spoke about Canada, spoke about how we need to learn certain things, how we need to act on certain things. And it's the way he has reacted to difficult issues on, you know, so many fronts. It's not a question of him. It's not a question of his government. He tries to make it about all of us and in lessons that we can learn. To a degree, I understand it. Look, racism is alive and well in Canada. You may not see it. I may not see it, but it is there. Is it the same as the United States? No, it's different, but it is there. And we have our own racism, from Sir Wilfrid Laurier sending agents down to stop black farmers in Oklahoma from going up to settle the prairies. He signed an order in council in 1911 banning black immigrants coming into Canada. I mean, you can go example after example throughout our history. But it was a bizarre reaction, a bizarre pause, and bizarre commentary from Trudeau, because I'm not sure he knows what to do. He knows that he's compromised because of his past actions involving blackface.
So Trudeau didn't have much to say about the Trump photo op with the protesters and the tear gas, but he did have something to say regarding admitting Russia back into the G7 talks, which Trump is in favor of.
He said absolutely not. He's not in favor of that at all, and he cited Crimea, and I've got to support him on this. Look, if you remember, Russia was it became the G8 for a while, right? It wasn't the G7, it became the G8. And then Stephen Harper was famously at a G20 meeting in Australia shortly after Russia annexed Crimea. And Stephen Harper walked up to Putin and said, "I only have one thing to say to you: get out of Ukraine." That was his message. So I'm glad to see that there's a bipartisan stance by Canada on this. This is not a liberal or a conservative thing. This is a Canadian thing. We don't accept Russia's aggression towards Ukraine. And, you know, for people across the prairies, that might mean, you know, it's just because there are so many Ukrainians. Or, you know, more specifically, more recently, a good chunk of the Ukrainian population, Ukrainian immigrant population, has settled in and around Toronto. But I think it's more than that. You know, this is a part of the world that wants to embrace democracy, that relies on support of countries such as Canada and the United States, and we're backing them on that. We don't always take the right stance. I don't think we've taken the right stance when it comes to Hong Kong, because the Trudeau government is afraid of upsetting the rulers in Beijing. But when it comes to Ukraine, Justin Trudeau has done the right thing, and I have to give him credit for it.
Brian, we've seen a lot of the images, a lot of the video of the rioting and looting taking place in the United States in wake of the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Canadian stars and athletes have spoken out about the racism, not just in the U.S., but Canada as well, including a couple of former big-name CFL stars like Mike Pinball Clemens and Smilin' Hank Burris. Now, Pinball actually said there's a reason why he decided to stay in Canada.
Yeah, we've been hearing from all kinds of athletes. A ton of the Toronto Raptors, Fred Van Vliet, Pascal Siakam, the general manager, Masai Ujiri, all of these people speaking out. Even Austin Matthews, who, if you don't know, he's from the Phoenix area. Austin Matthews is a star in the Toronto Maple Leafs, but he's an American. And as he pointed out the other day, a Latino American who's dealt with his own forms of racism, but not quite like this. But, on the Canadian side, Henry Burris, who I used to work with at Bell Media in Ottawa, he was on the TV side, I was on the radio side. And I got to know him in a way outside of football. Loved watching him play for football, except when he was, beating up my Tiger Cats. Loved watching him play. And then got to know him as a man, got to know him as a broadcaster. He's a fantastic man, fantastic broadcaster. And Smiling Hank is angry right now. He's angry at the racism he's seeing. He's angry at images of a man being killed. Many people are surmising simply because he's black. Turns out that the officer who knelt on his neck for 9 minutes had known him for a long time. So is there racism involved? Most likely. Is there a personal beef involved as well? Quite possibly. We're going to have to wait to see why. Regardless, this should not have happened, and it happens too often. And the black community in the United States is speaking out. Henry Burris is speaking out. Pinball Clemens, former Toronto CFL star, never liked him as a player because he was good, but he's a fantastic individual. And he was doing a local Toronto TV interview, and they asked him about the racism in Canada. And he said, look, I stayed in Canada for a reason. And when people would ask me why, and he would say, because if I looked to a new venture in the United States, I would have to prove that I was competent because of this racism that is rampant in many parts, not all, but many parts of the United States. He said in Canada, I'd have to prove that I was incompetent. And that's the short version of his answer. So does racism exist here? Absolutely. Is it different? Absolutely. I don't begrudge anybody for speaking out at this. I don't understand the violence and the looting, especially when it comes to a bunch of white kids in Montreal smashing the window of Steve's Music Store. But as a former Montreal reporter, I can tell you they will riot because it's Tuesday and steal what they can and co-opt any, valid issue that's out there as a reason to riot. And that's what we saw in Montreal, and it's what we've seen in too many places, quite frankly. There is an issue with the murder of George Floyd. There is an issue with racism, but too many people are jumping on it in a way that does dishonor to this man's memory.
Brian, we have not had a regular meeting of Parliament in months, and if the Liberals, NDP, and Green Party have their way, it may not come back until September, despite a spending bill of over $150 billion.
Yeah, I'm reminded of that 50 song, "See You in September," right? The teeny bopper love song of my parents' era. I don't understand this. Yes, I know there's a pandemic on, but we should be able to find a way to have a functioning parliament, and we haven't. For anyone that thinks we have, we don't. Look, the Ontario legislature has been meeting with reduced members present. So all of the parties have agreed to restrict the number of members and keep it proportional. It's not the bare minimum. It's not the minimum caucus. And then independent members show up at will because they don't have a caucus whip to stop them. They've been holding question period. They've been debating legislation. I know this has happened in other provincial legislatures as well. But in Ottawa, at our national parliament, we have this thing where as soon as they start, they dissolve parliament into the committee of the whole. So it's not a regular sitting. The opposition does not have the same tools at their disposal to hold the government account. They do not have normal question period. And the Liberals wanted to keep it this way till September and have just 4 meetings over the summer to debate a spending bill that we're told could be $150 billion. Jagmeet Singh defended this. He was on question period over the weekend saying, oh, this has more accountability than regular parliament. And when pressed on it, said, well, in regular question period, I only get 2 questions of 30 seconds each, but here I get 5 minutes. Well, I'm sorry, it's not the Jagmeet Singh show, it's Parliament. And Parliament as a whole has been weakened by this. We are going to find a whole scandal after this. We know there will be problems. Look, we know that there were problems with rolling out the emergency aid at the beginning because I will cut them some slack. They're coming up with proposals and programs in a matter of days or a week or two instead of months to years. And both the NDP and the Conservatives, to a lesser degree the Bloc, made suggestions that improved many of the programs that we see, from the CERB to the wage subsidy to support for small business. All of these things have been improved with opposition not only supporting the government and passing it, but saying, well, hold on, have you thought of this? Now we're being told that the opposition's input isn't welcome. The Prime Minister governs from the steps of Rideau Cottage. He stumbles down each day, gives his news conference, goes back in, and that's it. I'm sorry, answering a few questions from the media, as much as we think that we're incredibly important, Hal, we're not the people's elected representatives in the media. And we do not substitute for members of Parliament. Parliament needs to come back. The Parliamentary Budget Officer has called this unprecedented and unfortunate, to say the least, was his quote.
Brian, the Trudeau government is still looking at banning a long list of rifles and force gun owners to hand them over. I've spoken to a lot of gun owners here in southwestern Alberta. They're not happy about it. Now, you've actually checked out cases where actual gun criminals are being released. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, there's been a couple right here in Toronto in the past week or so because of COVID. Oh, well, we can't keep you in jail. There's COVID. You've got to get out. You get bail. One guy's named Hans Thomas. He's got a career criminal record going back to 2003. Multiple gun charges over and over again. He's been banned from driving, caught driving. He's been banned from possessing any sort of weapon. He's caught driving with a gun in the car or a shotgun in the car. They're never legal guns. He's never gotten his license. He doesn't buy them at Cabela's or Bass Pro Shop or Canadian Tire or your local sporting goods store. He buys them on the black market. And so, and he's been out on bail while he's been caught. So I believe the way it goes, I don't have the full timeline in front of me, but I believe within a year, he was caught and charged with on one front, sent to jail, stopped showing up for his weekend because he was only sentenced to serve his time on weekends, stopped showing up, arrest warrant put out, caught again with a shotgun in a car that he's not supposed to be driving, given bail, released, caught again a couple months later in driving another vehicle with a .45 caliber handgun in the car, along with cocaine and meth and all these things. Then there's this woman, Rima Mansour. You may have heard of this case. It got quite the headlines. She was caught with about 25 handguns in the gas tank of a rental car trying to cross between Buffalo and Fort Erie, Ontario. She'd driven down to Tampa, got the illegal guns, brought them out, allegedly drove down to Tampa, bought the illegal guns, and they were mysteriously in the gas tank of her rental car as she came back across the border. She's been in jail since she was busted on this more than a year ago, and she has since been let out. Meanwhile, the government's going hammer and tongs against legal gun owners who have not broken the law other than Cabinet passed an order declaring them all to be bandits.
Brian, the federal Conservatives are looking at holding debates this month and selecting a new leader in August. Now, who are some of the frontrunners to replace outgoing Andrew Scheer? We're still looking at Peter MacKay and Erin O'Toole. How about social conservative Leslyn Lewis?
Leslyn Lewis is there's only four. There's Peter MacKay and there is Erin O'Toole. Those would be considered the front runners. Leslyn Lewis and Derek Sloan are fighting for the social conservative side. And my sense, we don't have any accurate polling of people who have actually bought and paid for their Conservative Party membership. But my sense is that Leslyn Lewis will be doing better than Derek Sloan and is surprising a lot of people who may not necessarily be on the social conservative side of the party, but they're not happy with either O'Toole or MacKay and are looking for someone else to support. So I think she's going to do very well. Peter MacKay, it was his race to run away with, but he's had a series of missteps, and Erin O'Toole has been running a slow and steady as she goes campaign, a bit of a tortoise in the hare, and maybe catching up. So it'll be interesting to see how they perform in the debates. They're June 17th and 18th, and then voting will take place, and I believe the leaders picked August 26th, if I'm going from memory there, but it is towards the end of August. So look, we need Parliament back, and we need an actual Conservative leader, because Andrew Scheer is on his way out. That lessens his hold on caucus. It lessens his importance. He's been doing a decent job, but nobody looks at him as the real leader of the Conservatives anymore, because by the end of the summer, he won't be.
You know, it's interesting, though, ever since Andrew Scheer decided he's stepping down as Conservative leader, I've really liked this guy. I thought he's been a lot looser. He's been saying what he means. He's very forthright. Maybe he's got nothing to lose. He figures, you know what, throw caution into the wind. I'm going to say it as I see it, right?
Yeah, there might be something to that in terms of, I've looked at him a few times and said, where was this guy during the election? And look, I've known Andrew Scheer since he was first elected in around 2004. I've been at this a long time, Hal. And I've seen him rise up, and then he kind of froze out for a little bit during the election campaign. Would have been nice to see some of this fire in the belly during the campaign. It was there at times, but not often enough.
Toronto Sun political reporter and one of our regular contributors, Brian Lilley, thanks again for joining me.
Thank you, Hal.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, and thanks so much for watching.